Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Samach. Today's daf is dedicated in memory of the 6 hostages: Hirsch Goldberg Polin, Ori Danino, Edin Yerushalmi, Almog Sarusi, Alexander Lubanov, and Carmel Gad, who were murdered just a few days ago. Our thoughts and prayers are with their families, and we continue to pray for the release of all the other hostages. Okay, I know it's been a hard day for everybody. Wish us strength, and I hope that our learning provides us with strength, our grounding, and for me, at least, it's a little bit helpful. We're going to get started now with our Mishna. So we learned the Mishna yesterday, which distinguished between different cases. If I sell a field, what is included in the field? Now, it's going to be a very tedious stuff, I will warn you. A lot of very specific details. But I want you to think about the overall concept of what's going on here. And it's something that's been going on throughout our Masechet in general, particularly this last section of our Masechet, of what, and we've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again, right? As similar to things we talked about in Nidarim, all about the power of our words. And maybe it's a good thing to think about these days. The power of our words and what is important about what we speak and when we say things very clearly and spell them out. And here, what we're really dealing with is a lot of people who didn't specify enough. And the question is, since they didn't specify what exactly was in the sale, it leads to deliberations. Well, what did you include? What didn't you include? Which parts were, which parts weren't? Something I learned the hard way the first time I did renovations on my house. I didn't realize that the better you spell things out, the better it is for you. I thought, oh, alas, okay, do something more, without really getting into, well, what exactly and what will it cost and all that, and figuring, oh, it's okay. But in the end, I got a whole long list with really high prices because I had never really negotiated them and never really talked about them. So the next time I said, well, I'm going to only do anything that I've discussed before, that we were very clear and very specific about what it was going to be, what it was going to cost, and it was a much better process. So this is really the lesson of all these dapim is, and we'll even see this, and one of the reasons I want to talk about today, first of all, I thought it was a good day to try to kind of zoom out and think about a bigger picture. And also, we're going to see that one of the languages used in the Gemara is it actually makes the star better if you add more words to it, right? And it makes it look nicer. Now, they don't really mean look nicer, they mean function nicer, because the more specific you are, the better it is for you. And here we're really discussing, which often the Gemara discusses, the problems, right? And the cases where we weren't specific. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be specific. This is just saying, if you weren't specific, this is what we're going to do. But really, the ideal is that you be specific, right? I'm just thinking, right, how the Gemara discusses usually unideal circumstances, like the whole beginning of Masechet Ketubot with, he says she wasn't a virgin. She says she was, and there's this whole argument. That doesn't usually happen in a normal marriage, right? We're not talking about the normal situations. We're talking about the situations where things didn't go the way they should have. And a sale should be pretty clear. But if you weren't clear, then we have to figure out how to handle it. And yes, any lawyer in the crowd will definitely attest to, how, in fact, someone in the Hebrew class said after class that she's a lawyer and she deals with houses and sales. And yeah, we write everything down. This includes this and it includes that, and right? As opposed to, when I rented a house, an apartment once, I remember they took out the light bulbs with them. So I came into a house, there were no lights, nothing. Okay. And, I wasn't so smart about saying, what are you leaving? Anyway, with that, we'll get started. That just puts a little bit of this stuff in perspective if you might find some of it a little bit tedious. So the Mishna had mentioned, and we're just going to go one by one through the cases in the Mishna, my avanim shehem litzorka. And we're going to actually, some of this stuff is going to be fairly easy because we're going to do all the cases that are included in the field at the first part of the Mishna. And then we're going to repeat some of the issues from the opposite perspective of the cases that are not included in the sale, as the Mishnah did. The Mishnah kind of compared. These are included, these are not included. And then we're going to talk about details of them and then talk about the details in the reverse. So, which makes the daf somewhat repetitive. My avanim shehem litzarka. So what stones could be useful in a field? What do you need stones for? For this, we're going to have two different interpretations, and then each one we're going to view through a bit of a different lens, which we'll get to soon, the Rabbi Meir lens and the Rabbi lens, which we're going to see soon what that is. Hachatirgamu, in Babylonia, they explained, avne de'achva. These are stones that were used to hold down the wheat after they cut it. It would be in piles, and we all know that wheat will blow in the wind. So they would put stones on top to hold it down. Ula gave a different interpretation. If you remember, Ula went back and forth to Israel, Babylonia. So I don't know if he was bringing the Babylonian interpretation, because Hachatirgum usually means here in Babylonia, and Ula was bringing the Eretz Israel interpretation. But Ula Amar, Avanim hasturot legadir. What do you need stones for? Not for holding down the grain so it doesn't blow away, but for making a fence around. And here we don't actually mean, I don't want you to get it wrong, it's not stones that are already a fence, that of course I guess would be included, but stones that are arranged in an arrangement ready to build a fence with. Okay, it makes me think of, apropos renovations, right? When you see construction sites, they have all the bricks lined up and everything's lined up very nicely and neatly, because that's the way they usually are when someone's building with them. So they're organized in these nice, neat rows for building. They're not built yet. It's not a fence yet, but it's organized for that. That will be included in the sale. So now they say, wait a minute, small question, side question. Hatane Rabbi Chia, doesn't Rabbi Chia have a braita that says, Avanim tzfurot legadir? Tzfurot means gathered. Doesn't mean they're in nice, neat, organized piles. It could just be a big pile of stones thrown together. So Tanei Sturot, they say, well, change it, okay? Amend that to say not svurot, but sturot. By the way, you remember the braitot were said orally, and svurot and sturot don't sound very different. You could see how perhaps you could get confused, or perhaps they just changed it and said, yeah, it must be organized, because it doesn't make sense if it say they weren't organized. Now we're going to go to this machloket Rabbi Meir and the rabbis that I made reference to before, which we mentioned a few dapim ago on Samachay, but I'm going to read it from its source, which is an Ayin Chedem Abed. Ayin Chedem Abed, a braita is quoted, and in that braita, only Rabbi Meir appears, but it's clear that they think the rabbis disagree. Rabbi Meir says that when you sell, it's a few lines before the Mishna on Ayin Chedem Abed, D'Tanya Rabbi Meir omer, machar et hakerem, machar tashmishei kerem. Rabbi Meir thinks that if you sell a vineyard, it includes anything that's serving the needs of that vineyard. So Rabbi Meir, we're going to basically say, has a more inclusive definition of what is included in a sale, whereas the rabbis are exclude more things. They think if it's serving the needs of the vineyard, but it's not, and then the question is, what exactly is it not? But it's not clear. It could be used for other things. It could be, right? It's not as designated as possible for this field, then it won't be included. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take these two definitions of the Amoraim, and I want you to get the time right, which is Amoraim or later, and now we're going to read them, that's why I said through the lens of Rabbi Meir and through the lens of the rabbis. Now the rabbis weren't discussing Ula or the Babylonian interpretation that was in the time of the Amoraim, but the Amoraim are coming and saying, well, how would Rabbi Meir explain this, and how would the rabbis explain it differently? So we're going to read this Mishnah, this part of the Mishnah, through both their viewpoints. And we're going to do this also to other parts of the Mishnah as well. So so in Babylonia, where they say it's these stones that hold down the stalks of grains from blowing away, Rabbi Meir de mitaknan afagav de lo machtant. For Rabbi Meir, they would be mitukanim. We're going to have to explain what this is, even though they're not machtan from linchot, which linchot, like for a plane in modern Hebrew, is to land, okay, as opposed to being placed down like lahaniach, to put down. So what does this mean? Good question. Some people think it means that as long as you designated them, even if they're not placed in the field at all, in other words, they're not even on the grounds of the field. There's a field and there's these stones that are outside the field, but designated to be used in the field to put on top of the grain of the stalks. So that's what we mean. According to Rabbi Meir, that will be included in the sale, because remember, Rabbi Meir said anything that's for the use of this. So once you designate it for use, that's sufficient. Some people think they're already in the field. That's mitaknan, you put them aside in the field, but lo machtan means you didn't put them on the stalks yet. So there's a deliberation among the commentaries what exactly this means. Le Rabbanan hu demachtan, but according to the rabbis, it would have to actually be placed. So again, depending on which interpretation, either placed in the field itself to be included in the sale, or to be placed actually on the stalks. Ula damar avanimas turot legadir. Now we're going to do ula through the lens of Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. According to Ula, who says they're avanim that are organized for offense, le Rabbi Meir de metaknan afagav de lo sdiran. For Rabbi Meir, they would just have to be designated even if they weren't organized in neat rows. Okay, which is strange because it did say organized sturot, but we'll have to explain sturot a little more loosely according to him, because again, we want to come up with some sort of distinction. So we'll say, okay, they were there, they were designated, but they weren't necessarily organized. The Rabbanan who decidran, but according to the rabbis, it would only be if they were actually in these neat rows that would be clear that they were designated for use for building. Now moving to the next case in the Mishnah. So what we did here was we took two different interpretations of what these stones were used for, and then each one we viewed through the prism of Rabbi Meir and the rabbis' debate about the vineyard, which would apply here as well. So now we move to the vineyard, and we have reeds in the vineyard that serve the needs of the vineyard. What are we doing with reeds in a vineyard? They're split. Okay, the easiest way to think about this is like a lulav. At the top, it splits a little bit, right? So you take a reed where you split the top, the middle, the stem of it in the middle, you open it up, and then it has, because it's open a little bit at the top, you can place the vines there, okay? Instead of the vines draping on the floor, dragging on the floor, so mamidim tachat agfanim. So you put them under the vines. Basically the vines go on top of them. Better way of saying it than you put them under the vines, but you would basically help stand up the vines with these reeds. Now, what's the difference between Rabbi Meir and the rabbis with this? And what would they disagree? Le Rabbi Meir de Meshapyan, afagav de lo mukman. To Rabbi Meir, it would be enough that you sanded them down a little, you fixed them up, okay, so that they're ready to go, but not necessarily that you stood them up yet in your field. And the Rabbanan, obviously, udemukman, you would have to actually stand them up for them to be included in the sale of this field. Now, any grains, this is the next case, any grains that are attached to the ground are going to be part of the sale. That's pretty obvious because they're anything right attached to the ground, although we'll see maybe not, but most things attached to the ground are going to go with the field. Now, we've seen this sugya many times where we've discussed, there's this machloket, or it comes up, this issue, what if they're ready to be picked? Some people view things ready to be picked as if they're already detached, and perhaps that wouldn't be included in the sale, to which the Gemara says, even if they're ready to be picked, they're still, if they're attached to the ground, then the buyer gets them. Remember, we had this little, reeds grew around this little area and sort of designated it as its own separate space. But if it's less than a space that you could actually plant anything in, it's less than a quarter kav, can't plant more than a quarter kav of seeds in it, then it's not significant. And therefore, it's included in the sale because it's not its own space, right? Once it becomes its own space, it won't be included in the sale of the field because it's not part of the field. This is not significant. To which they say, afagav de alime, even if the reeds that grew were very thick and solid, and therefore made like a very serious border around this space, because it's such a small space, it doesn't matter, it's going to be included in the sale of the field. Ve'eta shomera she'ena asuya betit. Now you have this little booth for the guard, and the guard sleeps there even, but if it's not plastered with clay, it's not significant in and of itself. Now, the Gemara says this line, which is a little confusing. I'm going to try to explain it without getting you confused. Even if it's not attached to the ground. Now, it's a little confusing. I'll tell you why it's confusing. If it's not plastered with clay, that makes it less significant. You would think, though, if it were attached to the ground, that would make it more significant. So by saying, even though it's not attached to the ground, it's still not significant. It should be the reverse, theoretically, because even if it's attached to the ground. But what did we say a minute ago? Things that are attached to the ground are actually more likely to be part of the field. So what they're saying is, it would go with the field. So what they're saying is this. If it's not plastered with clay and attached to the ground, it's obviously going to go with the field because it's attached to the ground and it doesn't stand on its own as something of significance because it's not plastered with clay. However, what they want to add here is, even if it wasn't attached to the ground, it's still, now again, attached to the ground would make it more likely to go with the sale. Now they say, even if it's detached from the ground, and then you might say, well, it's movable. No, but it serves the field and it's not significant enough because it's not plastered with clay. So it's not a significant enough independent unit. So even if it's not attached to the ground, which would make it less likely to be part of it, because again, ground, field means anything attached to the ground, like the grains. But even though it's not attached to the ground, since it doesn't stand on its own because it's not plastered with clay, it's not important enough, it goes with as part of the sale. These are the two trees that are kind of too young or not significant enough, right? It wasn't grafted, so it's not such a great carob tree. Or the betulata shikma, where it's too early and it's not yet, doesn't really have any wood that we could cut from. Even if they're solid trees, okay, they're strong, solid trees, it doesn't really matter. They're still not important enough on their own, and they won't be part of the sale. That was the whole first section of the Mishnah. Now we're going to go to the second part of the Mishnah, all the parts that are not included in the sale. And some of this, like I said, is going to be the reverse of what we said before. But any stones that are not for the purpose of this field are not part of the sale. Now, obviously, we're not talking about stones that have nothing to do with the field, so it would have to have something to do with the field, but yet still not be included. So what would that be? Rabbi Meir de lo mataknan, Rabbanan de lo machtan. It would be the reverse of the previous, which is, according to Rabbi Meir, it would be you hadn't yet designated them for use in the field. According to the rabbis, you could have designated them, but you didn't place them, again, either place in the field or place on the stalks, and then that would basically say they're not included in the sale. Ula, and that's all if we assume we're talking about the first interpretation of stones. If we go with Ula's interpretation of stones, Rabbi Meir de lo matachna, Rabbanan de lo sidran. That's what we said before. Rabbi Meir would say you hadn't even designated them yet for use as your fence, and according to the rabbis, you hadn't set them up in this neat, organized manner. And then, as long as you didn't do that, even if you designated them, they wouldn't be included in the sale because you didn't do enough. And not stalks that are detached from the ground. Now, that should be pretty obvious. So they add, well, even if sometimes you would put the stalks out on the land to dry, and you need the land for it to have somewhere to be, to dry out, and therefore, even if it needs the sadeh, the stalks need the field, they're still not considered attached to the ground and therefore not included in the sale. This is going to be, again, the reverse, the opposite case. Even if the reeds are very thin, not significant, since it's surrounding a field that's already in a space, that's already it's a space in and of itself, it's separate from the field and it's its own designated area, it would not be included in the sale. This is just an example. It's not just if it's an area surrounded with reeds. But comes Rabbi Yochanan, or quoted by Rabbi Chia bar Abba, says, even if it's a little small patch that you use for certain spices, which is called, within your field, you have a little garden of something, and it has its own name, then because it has its own name, it's not included in the sale of the field. And Rav Papa gives an example. Like if you call it the roses of so-and-so, okay, the rose garden, this garden, it has its own name, it would not be included. Now we're going to have the reverse. Even if it's attached to the ground, which you would think then, again, would be, right, even though that makes it more significant, but no, you would think attached to the ground would mean it goes with the field, because anything attached to the ground of the field would be part of the sale. But since it's plastered with clay, it's already significant and is considered its own unique entity, is not included in the sale of the field. Skipping the words that are in parentheses, because that really belongs later. By Rabbi Elazar. Now we're going to have three questions that are not exactly related, but they have to do with things attached or not attached to the ground, or attached or not attached to something, or depends on how they're attached. And there are three kind of disconnected questions. The first two are a little similar. The third's a little different and also has different interpretations what exactly the question is. But we seem to be moving away from a field and into a house. If you sell a house, malbeinot shel ptachim mahu. You have a door frame. Okay, it's hard to know because we don't really know how their doors were built. We talk about a door frame and a window frame. Seems to be different than the way we have things. So these frames of a door, what would be the case? Would they be included? Remember, the door is included in the sale of a house. What about the frame around the door? If it's plaster, if it's glued in with cement, with clay, with something significant, obviously we're not asking a question about that, because that's obviously attached in place. But the question is, what if it's with pegs? And pegs can come out pretty easily. So if it's attached in such a way that you could take it out pretty easily, what's the case? Is it included, or do we say it's not really attached? This has to do with what we talked about before, something being attached to the ground versus not being attached to the ground. That seems to be how we got here. And we're not going to have any answers to any of these questions. Teku. By Rabbi Zera. So they're each asked by somebody else. Rabbi Zera asks, what about a window frame? A window frame, not a door frame. Do we just say this is for decorative purposes? That's why I say we don't really understand, because our window frames usually are to make sure that the glass stays in place. It's not exactly for beauty. So it's just for decorative purposes, and then it wouldn't be included. Or do we say, well, it's connected, even though it's connected with these pegs, but it is connected, so and the Gemara answers, again, teku. By Rabbi Yirmiyah. Remember, Rabbi Yirmiyah always asks those questions, so here we have a question of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Their beds were made, it's basically a base. We've seen this a bunch of times with legs. Now, the legs were made of wood, or at least in some cases. Now, if the legs are made of wood and they stand on the ground, now the ground in the houses was dirt, which means the wood could rot pretty easily, because if the dirt got wet, right, every time you wash the floor and then the wood absorbs the water, they would rot. So what they would do is they would put these little, like we do with chairs and things like that, right? There's a little base at the bottom to basically raise it off the floor and protect the legs from rotting. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says, what about these? Now, what's the question? What about them and what? So some people think that the question is, if you're selling a bed, and then we're totally switching topics. We're not talking about a field. We're not talking about a house. We're talking about if you sell a bed. Are they included in the sale of the bed? Some people think that we're saying because they're attached to the ground, perhaps they would be included in the sale of a house, even though your bed won't be. Maybe these pieces that you actually stick into the ground, maybe will be included in the sale of a house. To me, it seems like the first option seems like a more realistic option, so I'll go with that, but know that there's different interpretations here. So if you sell the bed, do they come along with it? If when you pick up the bed, they go with it, the base of the bed, this will be attached, then obviously then it obviously moves with the bed, and therefore it'll go with the sale of the bed. But our question is, but if they're separate, they're not pegged in so strongly, they're not nailed in, but there's a way to remove them very easily. What would be the halacha? And the answer is teku. We don't have an answer. Okay, now we're getting back to our topic. These are the two types of trees that are not included in a sale. And now the Gemara asks, turning now to Amabet, where do we get this from? Is there a source for this? And in fact, there is a source in the Torah. From where? Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, da Amar Krav, vayakam stei Ephron asher b'machpelah. In the sale of Ephron Achiti to Abraham of Maran Machpelah, we see a source for this. Now, they don't tell us the rest of the pasuk, which is where really the source is. So we have to read the rest of the pasuk. It's Bereshit chapter 23, verse 17. So it says, the Sadeh of Ephron asher b'machpelah, vayakam, right? It becomes established. Asher lifnei Mamre, okay, they're giving the where it is. Hasadeh, the field, v'hama'ara, and the cave, asher bo, that's in it. Here comes the important words, v'chol ha'etz asher basadeh, and all the trees in the field. Okay, you probably never paid attention to this verse, because we usually think of selling marana, buying marana machpelah. We don't really think about the trees. The trees also were sold to Avram. Okay, we could have ended the pasuk right there. But then it says, asher b'chol gvulo saviv. That is in all of his, right, in the borders of the territory, all around. What are those words there for? So first we're going to explain the word asher b'chol gvulo, that it's in all of his borders. And then we're going to have a different drasha on the word saviv, all around. Why do you need that word, even if you need the other words? So what do they say? What do you learn from asher b'chol gvulo saviv? Mi shetzarich ligvul saviv. What was included in the sale? Anything that needs a border around it. We'll explain in a minute what that means. And that excludes anything. What wasn't included in the sale was anything that doesn't need a gvul. Now, what does it mean, a tree that needs a boundary around it? Well, let's say I buy a tree in your field. If I buy a big, significant tree, okay, and it's a tree that everybody recognizes, okay? Everyone knows there's some trees in their area that everyone knows that tree. Maybe yes, maybe no, but there's always, big trees that are noticeable. If I bought a big tree in your field, I wouldn't need to put a border around it and designate it as my own, because everyone would have heard that I bought this big tree, and everyone would know. You have to remember, also more of an agricultural society, maybe nowadays a little less so, but everyone would know that that's my tree, and I wouldn't need to designate it. I wouldn't have a problem later that you'd say, oh, it's my tree, because everyone knows. But if I buy a small tree, then I would have to designate it as my own and do something to say, this is mine. So I put a little border around it and designate it, this is my tree. That's what we're talking about. If it needs a gvul saviv, if it needs a boundary, meaning without that, the owner could just say it's my own and I didn't sell it to you, that's the kind of tree that Ephron sold, because it's not a significant enough tree. But anything significant, he didn't sell. Now, if you remember, okay, the Rashbam tells us, it says in the Torah, natati kesef hasadeh. I gave money for the field. And Avram didn't specify what in the field was going to be his. And therefore, we assume it was just the word field. And this then shows us, what does the field include? It includes anything that wouldn't need a border around it. That would need a border around it. If it was so significant it wouldn't need a border around it, then Ephron didn't sell that to Avraham. And again, we don't know what Ephron really sold, but that's the drasha here. And therefore, we're going to learn from there that if we sell a field and we just say field, it's not going to include any of the very big, important trees, like the charuv and the charuv, which is already grafted, the carob tree that's grafted, and not the sycamore tree that already can be, that's big enough that you can cut the wood from. Saviv, what do we do with this word saviv? This is a total not connected, but it's just because we mentioned this pasuk. Amar Rav Sharshia mikan lemitzarim min haTorah. A bunch of different interpretations. I'm going to go with the first interpretation Rabbeinu Gershom quotes, which is not what the Rashbam says. You can look up if you want to see the other. But the Rashbam says we're talking about that, and this I think is very interesting. And what's interesting is there's different interpretations. So according to one, this is a Torah law. According to someone who understands it differently, it's not a Torah law. That when you sell a field, you have to designate the borders. You have to say, here's the border on this side, here's the border on that side, which is very interesting halacha, because if you say this is what the halacha is, but it means that you really have to be clear, because your job is to prevent miscommunications later. So you should be very clear and designate all the borders and don't leave things open. It's really important to be very specific, and that goes back to what we talked about in the beginning of class. As does the next line, Amar Rav Yehuda, if you're selling land to someone, you have to write, if you're selling a field and you're selling the trees in the field, particularly the palm trees, although there's, again, most of the stuff, there's many different interpretations of a lot of things, as in most dapim. You have to say, and I'm just going to go with one, which is, you have to say, I'm selling you the big palm trees, that's the dekalim. Talin is the small palm trees. Again, there's different, some people think not, but let's go with that. Hutzin, the branches, and the tzitzin, and the, forget now how, but some people say that these are both two types, like a shrub. They're shrubs, or they're some sort of, perhaps they're palm trees without fruits on them. Different interpretations, but basically be as specific as possible. Even if you didn't write this, they would be acquired with the field. If you just said I'm selling a field, we're going to assume it includes everything, all the trees in the field. Shufra is from shefer, which is beauty. It's the beauty of the shtar, meaning it beautifies the shtar, it makes it better. Okay, again, we're not talking about aesthetic beauty. We're talking about This just makes for a much better document. The more specific you are, the better it is. Now we're going to end our daf with a whole bunch of cases where somebody specifies, I'm selling this, or this and this, or this with this, or this. We're going to have all different sorts of variations on language. And what's very interesting here, what the ruling is going to be, and they're going to go through each one in all different permutations. It's going to depend not only on the wording used, but on what the reality is, on what you have actually in actuality in the field. Okay, so we'll see how these cases develop. Amarle ara vidikle. If I say I'm giving you a field and palm trees, now how do we interpret this? Okay, again, it doesn't really matter what I meant, but if I said I'm selling you a field and palm trees, and let's say I have palm trees in the field, I didn't mean the palm trees in the field, because once I say field, that includes all the trees in the field, as we just saw. So what it must mean is I'm selling you a field, and in addition, I'm selling you palm trees. Now, I didn't say how many, but we always say mi'ut rabim shnayim. That means the minimum is 2, right? If I use plural, which I did here, because I said dikle, which is dikalim, plural. So I would have to provide you with this field and also 2 palm trees. Now, this is going to sort of depend what I have to do, depending on what I have. So chazina, we look at the situation and we see, if I have 2 palm trees somewhere else that I own, yavle tre dikle, I have to give you those 2 palm trees. What if I don't have? And I said I was going to sell you a field and palm trees. Well, I promised you a field and palm trees. I have to give it to you. So zavin le tre dikle, I have to buy 2 palm trees and give them to you. V'mishabde, if I have them lien to some loan that I didn't pay someone back, and they basically have a lien on 2 palm trees of mine, parik le tre dikle, I have to, or they might have on more, but I have to redeem, I have to pay back at least the part of the loan that relates to, that will cover the 2 palm trees, release them from the lien and give you those palm trees. That's because I said land and tkalim. Ara bid dikle, we're going to have all sorts of variations. I sold you land bid dikle, which means with palm trees. So now, chazina, we check. Dikle, okay, if there's palm trees in there, perfect. Yavle, I give you the field with the palm trees. Ilav, what if I say I'm selling you a field with palm trees, and then it turns out it has no palm trees? Mekach ta'utu. This is a mistaken transaction. You could say, hey, I bought a field, you promised me it was going to have palm trees, and it doesn't. I want my money back. Ara beidikle, but if I sell you land that, okay, it's hard to translate this into English, but what they're going to say this language means, okay, bay is usually buy it. Like, I'll put it this way. It's like land that can house palm trees, even though it's not, you would use the word house, but that can, right, that you can grow palm trees. So lately, dikle, the buyer doesn't get palm trees. In other words, if there's no palm trees, they can't claim, oh, you sold me, you lied to me. Because what I meant is, it's a place where you can plant palm trees. It has space for it. It's got the weather, the climate for it. Amarle libar mi dikla planya. Here's a different case. I said, I'm selling you my whole field other than this specific palm tree. Now you might think, okay, that's pretty obvious. I sold you everything other than the specific palm tree. But in this case, we're going to see, it also depends. What did I mean? Chazinan, I dikla tavahu shire shire. If it's a really good palm tree, then obviously what I meant is I'm selling you the whole field, but I really like this palm tree, keeping it for myself. But if it's worse, that it's a bad palm tree, and I have better palm trees in my property, what I meant really when I said I'm selling you all these except this, what I meant is I'm selling you the whole field, but not all my palm trees. Because if I'm saying I'm even keeping this bad one, I obviously mean that I'm keeping for myself all the palm trees, and then I get to keep all the palm trees. It's amazing because I really didn't say that, but it seems obvious because who would say, but I'm keeping this one tree and it's a bad tree? There would be no reason for me to say that. Amalei levar me'ilane. Okay, now the end of our discussion is going to talk about the word trees. Okay, ilan is a tree, but what we're going to see is that people use different languages for different kind of trees. Ilan is a catch-all phrase for most fruit trees, but it seems that generally we'll see, people don't use it for palm trees, and they don't use it for a vineyard. Okay, so If I said I'm selling you this whole field. You have to remember, fields are usually for grain. So I'm selling you this whole field other than the trees. So that would mean, right, the part where you can plant stuff and not the part where there's trees there. So if I only have other fruit trees and not palm trees and vines, then basically levarmi ilane. It's clear. I've excluded all the other trees, right, which are all the trees in the field, and you get the rest of the field, just not the trees. What if there's only, we're going to talk about many options where there's only other fruit trees, there's only palm trees, or there's only vines. If there's only palm trees, well, even though ilan doesn't generally mean a palm tree, since there's nothing else there, and I said other than the trees, I must have meant the palm trees. So levarmi dikle, you get everything other than the palm trees. Gufne, if there's only, the Gemara doesn't say here only, but it obviously means only because you'll see the next few cases. If there's only vines, levarmi gufne, then ilano could also mean vines. Okay, again, only if there's nothing else. And here we're going to see. Ilane vigufne, if there's regular fruit trees and there's vines, and I said levarmi, and I said not the trees, ilane, levarmi ilane. Then we only exclude the ilano, but you get the vines because I said trees and trees. When there's trees and vines, we're going to assume trees means trees. Only when there's no trees do we assume that it means vines. And you can basically finish this up yourself almost. Ilane vidikle levarmi ilane. If there's trees, regular fruit trees, and palm trees, since I said ilane and I didn't say ilane vidikle, I obviously meant just not the trees, but the palm trees you're going to get. Because again, the word ilan doesn't generally mean palm trees unless we have no choice but to say it does. Now here's the one you might not have guessed, which is gufne vidikle. What if there's no ilanot? And I said no ilanot. I'm keeping the ilanot for myself. And there's vines and there's palm trees. Which one did I mean? Surprisingly, I think, because a dekel is more a tree than a vine, but levarmi gufne. Okay, this is all based on the language of how they spoke in those days. The more likely candidate between the geffen and the dekel is the geffen, is the vine. And last line for today, Amar Rav. Rav says, wait, I'm putting a limitation on this. Which case is he talking about? If I say not trees, ilanot, and there's only palm trees, but I have tall palm trees and short palm trees. Now, an ilan is usually something you have to climb up to get to. So he says, kol she'olin lo b'chevel have shiur. So if there's tall and short palm trees, only the ones that require climbing up with a rope are going to be are the ones that I kept for myself, because I said ilan, and ilan maybe could mean dekel, but it's going to be a dekel that's very tall. Funny they say that because decels are usually tall. But kol she'ein olin lo b'chevel, if it's a very short palm tree, lo have shiur, then I didn't mean that when I said ilan, because ilan generally means something tall. So, summary of today's daf. Already started the shiur, I'll kind of end it with saying again, it's all really important. If you take one lesson out of this daf, the more you specify, the better it is for you down the road. The more clear you are, even though sometimes you think better not to be clear, maybe, person will just throw something in, not true, right? Be very careful how what you say. And in a case when not, we have to go by what generally people do, right? And then you have to start making general rules. What do people usually mean when they say this word? What do people, right? All those kind of things that we've seen in many, many sugyot where the rabbis are trying to figure out, what do we do in a case where things weren't specified? We have to come up with rules to be able to determine what's right and what's wrong. Or it's not really right or wrong. It's what's customary and what we're going to do based on that. Because there is no really right or wrong here. It's just where do we draw the line? And like we even saw before with the rabbis and Rabbi Meir, there's a bit of a difference of opinion here. How much it needs to be serving the needs to be included or not. So we went through basically all the cases in the Mishna that are included and are not included. Some we specify, we wanted to know what this is or what its use is, and we had some different opinions. And then we also read a few things through the lens of Rabbi Meir and the rabbis' debate about the vineyard, which we applied to here. And then we also saw, even if this, even if that, it's still, yes, going to be included or not going to be included. And we saw the reverse in a lot of cases. And then we got to the source for the charuv and the shikma, which we learned from Efron Achiti, about the differentiation between which tree is included, which tree is not. And then we finished with this, better to write things in. It's just better. And then we went through all these cases where if you said something, it's going to depend on, number one, what language you use, and number two, what you actually have in your field. and then we can assess what it was you actually meant. And again, we might not be right, but we make an assessment based on what certain assumptions might be. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day. It'll be a quieter day and a day that will hopefully herald better news just over the coming weeks.